Thank you very much. Appreciate the alpaca bomb that kept me laughing. Good morning, everyone. So, as Hilton mentioned, my name's Amy Fenstermacher, and I lead the enterprise architecture competency for Ernst& Young's U.S. government and public sector advisory practice. So, today I'd like to talk a little bit about one of the biggest EA challenges I've seen, which is how to clearly and meaningfully drive value through enterprise architecture. Over the last several years, transformation has become a staple in our business. Seems like every company and every government is engaged in some form of digital or business transformation. As enterprise architects, we have an opportunity to be at the vanguard of these transformations, reimagining the way we work and designing the future. So, what's missing? Why is it that enterprise architecture isn't traditionally out in front leading the way? So, I've got a few observations. First, it's tough to clearly prove what an organization gets out of an investment in enterprise architecture. EA, by its very nature, acts as a rising tide that lifts all ships. When you do it well, the operational efficiency, decision making processes, and delivery of capabilities all improve. It's hard to attribute that directly to enterprise architecture. Second, we frequently hear the criticism that EA is sort of an ivory tower, that we aren't connected to the reality on the ground, that we don't get it. Because enterprise architecture focuses on the future, sometimes we miss the here and now. And third, despite the enormous volume of work and the bright minds and deep thinking that enterprise architects do, the fact is that EA by and large isn't driving that fundamental enterprise transformation. We're not radically changing the paradigm. So, what can we do? How can we drive value through enterprise architecture and also make sure people know about it? I propose a 5-point approach. Let's call it the COUNT method. So, first, and if you're here, you probably already know this, we need to step away from the idea that an enterprise architecture is something that can be quote unquote delivered. We need to establish an expectation of evolution. The EA should grow with the organization, starting out conceptual and visionary, and then take shape through continuous pruning and refinement. Delivery successes will happen at the project and program level, and new capabilities will present new opportunities. Delivering value early and often is the simplest way to build buy in and get a seat at the table for designing the future of the business. We just heard some of that from the Dana Farber presentation. So, when I supported a very large federal government agency through a modernization initiative, our biggest challenge was that everyone had a different set of priorities, and the systems were so antiquated that business activities were conducted almost entirely outside of the system designed to support them. It quickly became clear that to unify that vision, we needed visuals. In that case, the service oriented architecture was less important than seeing how it would actually feel to do the same job in that future system. So we focused first on a few key business processes, and then we designed a set of UI standards, designed some mock-ups that applied those standards to those business processes, and showed how it aligned with the tenets of the business vision. So when we did that, we built excitement for the vision and trust in our broader team. Second, enterprise architecture should be obvious. We need to speak directly to business impact in order to be compelling. To create opportunities to contribute to the future vision, enterprise architecture needs to have a clear connection to that business vision and needs to demonstrate explicit business value. This means that we need to clearly define the benefits and outcomes of successful enterprise architecture. And the easiest way to do this is to connect EA to dollars directly by including cost analysis and ROI into our decision making. We also need to continuously reinforce the relationship between EA and business strategy by showing where enterprise architecture feeds directly into that overall transformation roadmap. So the public sector may not be profit driven. Cost analysis and ROI aren't necessarily traditional public sector metrics. But the last decade has been a period of contraction across governments all over the world, and organizations are being asked to do more with less. Dissatisfaction with government services also grows as the gap widens between commercial and public sector user experience. So buying something on Amazon doesn't feel the same as requesting government services through a government website. That means that many of these classic profit drivers actually motivate the public sector as well. During architecture reviews for my current client, we've integrated total cost of ownership assessments into the conversation. As we've become more sophisticated over time, we've included differentiations like the types of resources required to support, the volume of support calls our help desk receives, and how often these calls are escalated to more expensive resources. And next, we plan to start working on metrics like a user frustration score. All of these are real dollar impacts that we can attribute to a strong enterprise architecture program. Third, enterprise architecture should, at its core, be useful. We can focus on roadmaps. Diagrams are intended to set a common understanding and convey complex relationships, but they aren't meant to be the architecture in and of itself. In order to achieve the business vision, the enterprise needs a transformation roadmap. This should be the most important tool in an enterprise architect's toolbox. And when I say roadmap, I don't necessarily mean a Gantt chart or a project plan, although if people like those, that's fine. What I mean is an artifact that gives the organization a sense of direction and urgency. So, in order to relate this back to the business, every artifact we build should have some direct relationship with the business vision and should have a reason for existing. For every artifact, our key questions are who actually needs this and what will they use it for? And when we answer those questions, we can include those answers right on the artifact. Something like this roadmap is a leadership level visual to show how we'll release new security components over time to achieve the business vision of frictionless anytime, anywhere, any device access to key systems required for doing business. So next, EA should be novel, and forgive me for being a little bit tortured to fit this one into the overall COUNT acronym. So we should start with the future vision. View the current state through the lens of the future state. We should define the future vision first and use that as a basis for evaluating the current state. If we truly want true fundamental transformation, it should be far enough from the current state that starting with the current state baseline will narrow the scope of the effort, which practically guarantees that the enterprise falls short of that true transformation. Future first architecture design demonstrates value much faster than the traditional approach of first analyzing the current business data, application, and technology architectures, and then moving forward to the future state. For that matter, if the goal is true transformation, the future state will be markedly different from the current state, which requires creativity and multimodal thinking. This means that we need to acknowledge that enterprise architecture doesn't just require technical expertise. We also need to know the business, understand trends, and maybe even dabble in behavioral and organizational psychology. As we just heard from Dana Farber, part of the reason why most enterprise architecture efforts start with a current state assessment is because it's a way to build trust with the decision makers that you understand their enterprise by coming to conclusions that they themselves have already drawn. Instead, we can do microarchitecture assessments to build trust. Start with a capability that's familiar and tease out a future vision and gap analysis for that specific segment or domain. So, for example, when I worked with a grants management organization, they had engaged multiple teams, big names over a period of several years to try and define their future state for them. When my team came in, we saw sort of what had happened with previous teams that attempted this task, and we started instead with one of the programs, limited our scope, and clarified the vision and gaps for that specific program. Then, after gaining the buy in for that one program, we were able to define a layer of abstraction on the technology architecture that we designed, which allowed for those same building blocks to be reused across the other programs in the organization. So we started at a narrower level, not necessarily trying to tackle the entire enterprise at once, and then lifted it up to apply to the entire enterprise. So fifth, finally, enterprise architecture should be tangible. That means that we should think strategically, but act tactically. It's rolling up our sleeves, embedding enterprise architecture with the teams actually executing the transformation tasks so that we can make the EA vision understandable, achievable, realistic, and consistent. So this doesn't mean getting into the weeds and taking on engineering or developer tasks or even doing code reviews. Instead, it means couching all of the technical requirements with a sense of purpose. So anyone who's used those agile style user stories knows that structure of as a some kind of user, I need to some kind of business function so that I can some kind of business purpose. And anyone who's seen those user stories in action knows that defining the business reason usually comes as a little bit of an afterthought. As enterprise architects, we have an opportunity there to anchor these requirements in the business vision, helping to give each requirement purpose and directly relate the requirements to the overall business vision. It's helpful for developers and designers to understand the business vision so that they can design effectively using their knowledge and leading practices. But it's also important for the business owners, the product owners, sponsors, et cetera, to see this connection so that they can prioritize effectively and clarify the outcomes that they can expect. So ultimately, to close the gap and step into the role of leading and designing true fundamental business and digital transformations, we enterprise architects need to make our activities continuous, obvious, useful, novel, and tangible. And now, if we've got any time left, I'm happy to talk through any questions or thoughts from the audience.
Thank you very much, Amy. That was a really interesting presentation. A question which has come up from a number of the attendees is you spoke about the future first perspective versus the current state perspective. Can you maybe talk a bit more about that and as to how you remind people through the process to focus on the future first perspective versus the current state perspective?
Yeah, absolutely. And frankly, this is a challenge that I've seen in multiple places where it's really hard to stay focused on the future when the current state is already here and we already have to address it. So sometimes what works is sort of separating the EA resources on the team into two sort of parallel streams. So one is supporting some of these sort of micro, what I would call transition architectures, so that we can define some steps toward a future state, while at least one or two resources on our team are exclusively focused on the research and market evaluations and trend analysis to think deeply about that future state. So there has to be some space for sort of taking a step away from the day to day and really thinking about what comes next and what constitutes the future of the business.
Thank you. Very interesting. Another question which has come up, you mentioned something around customer experience driving change, and I think you specifically mentioned the Amazon buying experience versus how people generally engage with state and local government. There seems to me to be a huge gap in that. Can you talk a bit more about how you drive that kind of talk track in government and if that is something that they're actually connecting with?
Yeah, absolutely. I frequently call on the example of the Affordable Care Act as an instance where not designing with the end user in mind cost the government a whole pile of money right off the bat because they had to completely re-architect and redesign their platform for the Affordable Care Act when the first attempt was rolled out and frankly failed. So that's sort of a scary example, but it usually is effective in reminding government stakeholders that it's of critical importance to design all of these end user resources well. And I will also say that in government right now, especially in the US government, but I know that governments all over the world are thinking like this, rather than benchmarking end user performance against other government resources, there's a move toward benchmarking against industry performance. So evaluating user satisfaction against the likes of Google, Amazon, and others.
Thank you. Thank you. That's a really interesting answer.